Welcome to Ben Franklin's World, a podcast about early American history with Liz Covart. The study of history is key to understanding who we are and how we can affect a better future. Ben Franklin's World will introduce you to historical people and events that have impacted and shaped our present-day world. And now, here's your host, Liz Covart.
Hello, and welcome to episode 85 of Ben Franklin's World, the podcast dedicated to helping you learn more about how the people and events of our early American past have shaped the present-day world we live in. We often view the American War for Independence as a conflict between Great Britain and her 13 North American colonies. But it was also a civil war. Not only did the war pit Britons against Britons, but the war also pitted Americans against Americans. We've all heard stories about the challenges faced by the Patriots, those men and women who won the war. But what about the other Americans involved in the conflict? Those who remained loyal to Great Britain? Today, Bonnie Huskins, Honorary Research Associate and Coordinator of Loyalist Studies at the University of New Brunswick, joins us to explore the experiences of the American Loyalists. During our exploration, Bonnie reveals who the American Loyalists were, how individual Loyalists experienced their evacuation from the United States, and the varied experiences of the white and African American Loyalists who settled in Canada. But first, Ben Franklin's World is a finalist for an award, the Academy of Podcasters Award for Best History Podcast. The Academy of Podcasters Awards are like the podcast Oscars, and they're a big deal within the podcasting community because they're awarded based on craft. It's truly a great honor to have the craft of the show seen as being among the best. Now, there are 10 finalists within the history category, and Ben Franklin's World is up against a slate of great shows. But I've submitted the 5-minute clip from the show, and I like our chances. The Academy of Podcasters will announce its winners on July 6. But regardless of how it goes, thank you for all of your support. The fact that you listen to the show and consider its diverse ideas about history, subscribe to the podcast, and tell your friends, family, and acquaintances all about Ben Franklin's World has helped to make the podcast what it is. And that's a success. Thank you. Please allow me to introduce you to our guest historian.
With tidings and wisdom to share about our early American past, here is this week's special guest.
Our guest teaches and researches history at St. Thomas University and the University of New Brunswick. At the University of New Brunswick, she holds the positions of Honorary Research Associate and Coordinator of Loyalist Studies. She studies the histories of the British Atlantic world, the transatlantic slave trade, and the diaspora created by the American War for Independence. Today, she joins us to discuss American Loyalists who settled in Canada. Welcome to Ben Franklin's World, Bonnie Huskins.
Oh, I'm really happy to be here. Greetings from Canada.
Well, hello from the United States, Bonnie. Thank you so much for joining us. Now, before we dive into specifics about Loyalists, especially those who settled in Canada, it seems like we should know who the Loyalists were. Bonnie, would you tell us about them? What did their demography look like, and what political, cultural, and economic values did they hold dear?
The question of who is a loyalist is not quite as straightforward as you might think. And I'd like to suggest 2 ways of approaching that question. One would be to look at them from the perspective of loyalist identity, and the other would be to look at them from the perspective of social history. Now, if we look at them from the perspective of loyalist identity, an obvious answer would be, well, loyalists were those who were loyal to Great Britain. Pretty straightforward. But the question for historians sometimes is, what did that loyalty actually mean? Now, for example, sometimes we see clashes between different ideas of loyalty or what it meant to be a loyalist. For example, in 1785, we see loyalist pitted against loyalist in the streets of St. John, New Brunswick, a loyalist town at the mouth of the St. John River. The context was the first provincial election. Some loyalists, particularly the elites, had aligned themselves with the colony's governor and the government party. And they argued that loyalty meant obeying British authority, whatever that might mean. Other loyalists became political dissidents, and they argued that their rights as British subjects entitled them to engage in protest if the status quo was unacceptable. It was part of their inheritance of British liberty. So they had different ideas about what it meant to be a loyalist, and sometimes they even clashed with each other. Now, loyalist identity could also be very fluid. It could shift and change depending on the context. So, for example, Thomas Brown, who was a plantation owner in the Georgian backcountry in the 1770s, he began as someone who wanted to stay out of the revolution. Now, that's until he was assaulted by a patriot crowd. He was tarred and feathered and so on. And after that experience, as you can well imagine, he turned into the commander of a loyalist militia and engaged in many assaults on patriots. So his identity actually shifted. Or your loyalist identity could be more nuanced. As a loyalist, maybe you actually agree with some of the patriot grievances, but at the end of the day, you still believe in membership in the British Empire. So loyalist identity is a lot more complex than we thought it was initially. I'd like to approach the question from the kind of history that I do, and that's social history. What I'm interested in are the people. What people were drawn to British lines and why? Now, the students in my Loyalist class had some fun last semester trying to figure out what factors would be involved in someone choosing the Loyalist side in the American Revolution. And some of the factors they came up with were, well, maybe some people had attachments to Britain. Maybe they were royal officials, they were merchants, they might have been recent British immigrants. Or maybe it had something to do with self-interest. Maybe they were runaway slaves who were freeing to British lines because of promises of freedom in return for service. Or maybe they were, Aboriginal members of the Six Nations Confederacy who supported the British in the Revolution and migrated to Canada to receive compensatory tracts of land. Or maybe they were economic opportunists and they turned to British lines because they believed they'd have better economic opportunities that way. Or maybe it has to do with family. Women's and children's decisions about allegiances quite often were made for them by their male relatives. For example, Sarah Frost, who was a young wife and mother from Stamford, Connecticut, her father and brother supported the Patriots, but her husband William supported the Loyalists. So she was forced with her children to flee to a Loyalist encampment on Lloyd's Neck in Long Island and ultimately to flee into exile in New Brunswick. I guess what I'm saying here from a social historian's perspective is that there's a broad diversity of folks who made their way to the British side during the American Revolution. Some of my colleagues wonder whether we should actually call these people loyalists or not. Maybe we should call them refugees or economic migrants or Aboriginal allies. But regardless of what you call them, they still did choose the British side.
In the United States, we tend to think of loyalists as the losers of the American Revolution. That is, of course, when we actually stop to consider the Loyalists, we think of them as the losers of the American Revolution. Were Loyalists really the losers, Bonnie?
I don't think so. I think that's kind of unfair. I think they're only losers if you place them in the context of American national history. In the context of Canada, quite often they come out on the other end. If we place them in the context of Canadian national history, they come out as heroes who planted the seeds of Canada. So they're both heroes and losers. I think that's just a little bit too simplistic. I mean, for example, if we were to place them within the context of the British Empire, there are historians who argue that by the Loyalists exiting from the United States into a Loyalist diaspora, they actually helped to integrate the British Empire. So rather than being losers or heroes, in this sense, they were agents of imperialism. So I think it's a little bit too simplistic to argue that they're either losers or winners. I think we have to get away from that. I mean, at the end of the day, they were people caught up in wartime. They were wartime refugees.
You're right. Many Loyalists were wartime refugees. They got caught up in the American War for Independence and had to flee the United States as a result, and their move wasn't exactly voluntary. Would you tell us about the Loyalist diaspora? Approximately how many Loyalists had to leave the United States, and how many of them settled in Canada?
A number that's bandied about in terms of Loyalists who left the United States is 60,000. Now, some say that's a highly inflated number because there are some issues with the sources. For example, in Loyalist lists and musters, Loyalists could be counted more than once. because a lot of them did experience multiple displacements. I mean, the same can be said of all the figures I'm going to mention here today. But at the very least, we can argue that tens of thousands were definitely uprooted. And in terms of where they ended up, about 35,000, we think, made their way to Nova Scotia. Now, Nova Scotia is on the Atlantic coast of Canada, just up from Boston. And in this time period, at least until 1784, it included both Nova Scotia and New Brunswick. So about 35,000 made their way to Nova Scotia. About 8,000 or 9,000 made their way to Quebec, which in that period would have been where Quebec and Ontario are today. But we also have to remember that they were also sent elsewhere throughout the British Empire. They were sent as far afield as England, Jamaica, Bahamas, West Africa. So they definitely were a global diaspora.
What was the process of evacuation like? Did all of the Loyalists leave the United States from New York Harbor?
You're right. The most well-known one is the evacuation out of New York City between April and November of 1783. But they were also evacuated out of southern ports. For example, Savannah in July 1782, Charleston, December 1782, and some of them were also evacuated from East Florida, because some had gone down there thinking that would be their new home. And when given over to the Spanish, they had to leave again somewhere else, usually to Bahamas. So there were multiple evacuations. And there also was a constant bleeding of the Loyalists north to Quebec and to Nova Scotia throughout the Revolution, aside from the official evacuations. So there were multiple evacuations.
What about the experiences of individual Loyalists? How did they experience their evacuation from the United States? Howard would like to know what happened to their property in the United States and whether the British military permitted Loyalists to take anything with them as they evacuated.
Yeah, the experience of evacuation was different from everyone, as you can imagine. But I have a really interesting diary written by a female Loyalist named Sarah Frost, and she migrated from Long Island to St. John, New Brunswick with 250 other Loyalists on board a vessel called the Two Sisters in May and June of 1783. And in her diary, we see that the voyage took about 5 weeks. She traveled with her husband, Billy, her 2 small children in tow, and she was 7 months pregnant. So she shows in her diary that, first of all, the ship cabin was very crowded, containing, 6 families besides her own. We see that despite the fact that Billy had been a Loyalist and, as a result, had broken up her family, she still seemed to love him, because she said on May 28th, 1783, quote, "Spent the evening on ship with my little family in playing a game of cards with Billy. As I have not mentioned him before, I may say he is my affectionate husband in whom I take delight." I thought that was quite lovely. After a visit ashore the next day by her son, she wrote about, quote, "how her little son pleases me very much about all he has seen." So it seems like a regular family life on board ship. But on the 9th of June, when all of the other Loyalist families were finally loaded onto the vessel, she recorded how there was, quote, "great confusion in the cabin. At night, one child cries in one place and one in another whilst we are getting them to bed. I think sometimes I will go crazy." The next day, she records in her diary that many of these same children were getting seasick. Now, there's only some indication that she's pregnant on the 13th of June, when she, quote, "am so unwell, I lie in my berth all day." And the same case the next morning. And she also records her husband, Billy, trying to make her life more comfortable and bringing her breakfast in bed. On Sunday, June 15th, not surprisingly, people were getting, quote, "cross and quarrelsome" on board ship. Not surprising. By June 19th, the winds were so blustery, she feared rolling out of bed. Finally, on the 29th of June, she left the vessel and walked onto the shoreline at St. John. And the last entry in her diary notes, quote, "it is the toughest land I ever saw." So I thought that's kind of a neat diary of a pregnant woman's experience of evacuation from New York to St. John. But in terms of Howard's question about goods, I have to remember that a lot of Loyalists had their property already seized by patriots, so they might not have had as many goods as you might think. But those more well-off Loyalists who did retain their property sometimes liquidated it, so they were able to turn their goods into cash before they left, which was more portable. There were well-to-do Loyalists who were able to afford having many of their goods brought to the docks for evacuation. For example, in New York City, we have descriptions of the docks in New York City just laden with fine furniture, four-poster beds, portraits, etc., etc. Other Loyalists probably came to the docks with a little more than the clothes off their back. Now, if the Loyalists were bound for exile in one of the public transports provided by the British Commander-in-Chief Guy Carleton in New York City, they would have been subjected to Carleton's orders on the 16th of April, 1783, to satisfy their debts before they left port, which of course sent many of them into a tizzy. As a result, a lot of the New York newspapers for 1783 are full of auction notices. So it might be that these exiles, to satisfy their debts, are trying to get rid of a lot of their furniture and personal goods before they left. Or it could be that the British are trying to encourage them not to bring quite so many household goods on the public transports. Now, that could explain why about 1 in 10 civilian Loyalists going to St. John, New Brunswick from New York actually did so on private ships. In that way, they could take anything they wanted, anything they needed. And it ranged from pigs, cattle, nails, glass, hinges, anything they'd need to start anew in a new place. Now, just before I leave that topic, there is an interesting collection in King's College Library in Halifax where there are glass cases in the foyer, and they contain a collection of china. And this china was collected by Susanna Weldon in the mid-19th century. And she collected these pieces of china from the descendants of the Loyalists who had originally brought them to Nova Scotia. And she says in the preface of the catalog to the collection, I just like to quote, "The original intention of this collection was to save from destruction some specimens of the china brought to the country by the Loyalists. It's a rather remarkable fact that in the hazardous departure of these refugees, though obliged in many cases to leave their books, plate, and even clothing behind, still the bowl in which some of their children were baptized, or some valuable articles of glass or porcelain, was always saved, and it's believed their descendants will place some value on these slight memorials of an ancestry worthy to be held in all honor." We know of families in New Brunswick and Nova Scotia who still have items which their Loyalist ancestors brought with them to Nova Scotia, whether it's a spoon, a fork, a plate. So yes, Howard, many Loyalists were able to bring goods with them. It wasn't always an easy proposition, but some goods still are passed down through families even today.
Your description of the Loyalists' departure reveals many different experiences, and knowing about these experiences humanizes the Loyalists. I mean, when we tend to think about Loyalists, we tend to think of them as a group, not as individual people. But now that we are thinking about them as individuals, could you tell us anything about the emotions they felt as they had to leave their friends, homes, and sometimes their possessions behind?
A lot of them definitely were upset. One of the things that I'm really interested in studying is the arrival of Loyalists in Shelburne, Nova Scotia. That's on the southwest coast of Nova Scotia. And one reason why I'm quite interested in them is that almost immediately upon arrival, they started building big homes, they put up taverns, they established Masonic lodges, they had a costume ball amongst the stumps and bonfires. And this is even before they're starting to build their first houses. A lot of commentators, for example, British immigrants, would look at this and say, what is going on with these Shelburne Loyalists? Why are they wasting all their money on froth rather than, invest in the economy and get their house in order? And it's my belief that one of the reasons the Loyalists are erecting taverns and holding dinner parties is that they're trying to recreate a little bit of what they left behind. They are emotionally distressed as a result of leaving friends and family behind. So they're doing whatever they can to try to recreate a sense of what they'd lost.
You've hinted at the geography of Canada, but would you help us better understand what Canada looked like when the Loyalists arrived? What did Canadian landscapes look like, and what were the colonies' major cities?
There's only two areas, really, where the Loyalists settled in Canada. One of them was Nova Scotia, and the other was Quebec. Suffice it to say, I think that any of the Loyalists who arrived from towns or cities in the American colonies probably thought they had arrived in the colonial wilderness when they arrived in Canada. In Quebec, there were cities like Montreal and Quebec City, but in Nova Scotia, the only real town or city would have been Halifax. So it was definitely more of a rural experience than many of them had been familiar with. Also, we have to remember that the Loyalists had a real demographic impact on this region. When they arrived, perhaps a combined population of Nova Scotia and Quebec would have been, say, around 166,000, maybe 110,000 in Quebec, 56,000 or so in Nova Scotia. So if you add 8,000 to 9,000 in Quebec, Loyalists, and 35,000 to the population of Nova Scotia, they're really having a tremendous demographic impact. So you start to see towns popping up all along the St. John River, for example, where Loyalists are settling. So they're definitely having a transformative impact on the landscape. What we also have to remember is that thanks to the arrival of the Loyalists, we have the formation of new colonies. New Brunswick is carved out of Nova Scotia in 1784, and that's as a result of the arrival of the Loyalists. The island of Cape Breton is also set aside as a separate colony for a short period. And Quebec is divided into Upper Canada, which would have been our Ontario today, as a result of the arrival of the Loyalists. It provided British institutions, so it was more attractive to the Loyalists. And Lower Canada, where a majority of the French Canadians still resided. So the Loyalists certainly had a transformative impact in terms of population, but also in terms of creating new colonies in British North America.
Did opportunities to start over differ between Loyalists who settled in Quebec versus Nova Scotia, or were chances to start over about equal regardless of where Loyalists settled?
Well, about on par, I would say. To be honest, we have in Canadian history the formation of what we call the Loyalist myth. And that's the idea that Loyalists who arrived in British North America, whether it be Nova Scotia or Quebec, were essentially the cream of the crop, right? They were the best of the best. We got the best and you got the rest. They helped to create the new country, which would become Canada. We now know that that was a myth, that there were elites in Upper Canada and also in Nova Scotia that did help to create, a hierarchical British order. But most of the Loyalists in Upper Canada and Nova Scotia were humbler folk. They were farmers, they were tradespeople, and really what they were hoping to get in British North America, I think overall, was a new start and a piece of land. Acreages could range from 200 acres to 2,000 acres, depending on who you were. But I think for the most part, most Loyalists in Upper Canada and Nova Scotia were just hoping for a new start.
Prior to the arrival of the Loyalists, New England planters had already settled in Nova Scotia. Would you tell us about the planters? Also, Kieran would like to know how the planters may have helped or hindered the ability of some Loyalists to start over.
The planters were settlers from New England who arrived in Nova Scotia just after the Acadian deportation. So they took over a lot of the lands that the Acadians had vacated. So they had come up shortly after the deportation and had established themselves quite nicely. And then you have the arrival of the Loyalists in the 1780s. And there's some evidence of resentment from the planters because they viewed the Loyalists as being, rather entitled. They received a royal bounty, provisions for 2 years. It seemed like nobody had suffered like the Loyalists. So there was a degree of resentment of this group. That is what I am seeing anyway. We also have to remember that the arrival of the Loyalists led to a displacement of other populations in this region. For example, a displacement of the Acadians who were starting to come back in the 1760s. They were further displaced in New Brunswick, and also a further displacement of Aboriginal peoples. So in one sense, New Brunswick's almost like a collection of displaced peoples, if you want to think about it that way. It's kind of ironic that a displaced people, the Loyalists, would arrive and then subsequently displace other displaced peoples.
Nate would like to know more about the experiences of African American Loyalists and slaves. Would you tell us about how African Americans experienced evacuation and resettlement? And did their experiences differ from those of white Loyalists?
That's a very interesting question. There were two groups of African Americans to arrive in Nova Scotia. One was a group of free black Loyalists. They mostly had been runaway slaves who had deserted to the British lines and expected compensation like the other Loyalists. And then slaves. It's estimated that about 10% of the Loyalists who arrived in Nova Scotia were African Americans. So about 3,500 Loyalists who arrived in Nova Scotia were actually Black Loyalists, plus about 1,200 slaves at the same time. Most of the history has been written on the Black Loyalists. For example, just outside of Shelburne, in Birchtown, Free Black Loyalists formed one of the largest free Black communities in British North America up to that point, around 1,500 to 2,000 people in that community at one point. Now, there's an historian named Amani Whitfield who says there are reasons why we know more about Black Loyalists than we know about slaves in this time period. And he argues that it's partly because of a very familiar paradigm that we have in Canada, and that is the whole idea that Canada always acts as a refuge, that there is a slavery to freedom paradigm that we're familiar with, and that we often think of Canada as always being the refuge, whether it be the Underground Railroad or whether it be the arrival of Free Black Loyalists. Amani argues that it's actually a much different reality than that. For example, slaves did arrive with the white Loyalists, and even the Black Loyalists, when they arrived, had a very difficult time in Nova Scotia. They had much smaller land grants, if any at all. They had difficulty finding wage labor and entered indentured servitude and sharecropping instead, which to them was almost like re-entering slavery. They experienced racism, whether it be segregated churches or segregated communities. John Clarkson, who was a British abolitionist in Nova Scotia at the time, argued that the Free Black Loyalists were not slaves technically, but they existed in almost a state of slavery. So that's interesting, that the whole idea that the Free Black Loyalists were arriving in a place which recognized slavery. Now, it didn't recognize slavery in a statutory sense. There was no statutory protection for slaves, like a slave code, for example. But they did recognize slaves as a form of private property under British common law. So I don't think that's something that the Free Black Loyalists were necessarily counting on, that they were arriving in a promised land which viewed most African Americans as slaves, even if they were technically free. So it's kind of a tragic story in Canadian history that we don't learn enough about. We usually associate Canada with the Underground Railroad. We don't learn as much about this part of Canadian history. And one thing we should also note is that some of the Free Black Loyalists became so upset with the conditions in Nova Scotia that they just decided to take part in the Back to Africa movement. And about 1/3 of the Free Black community in Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, eventually ended up going back to Sierra Leone to try again. That also had mixed success, but it's interesting that the Free Black Loyalists were disgusted enough by their conditions that they decided that going back to Africa was a better option than staying in Nova Scotia.
And of course, a lot of African Americans didn't go back to Africa. They were actually born in North America. Perhaps that's why Africa seemed like a better opportunity than Canada.
Yes, absolutely. What I find fascinating, too, is that because they were born in the American colonies, one of the reasons they decided to go back to Africa was not only a discouragement because of the conditions in Nova Scotia, but they also wanted to convert Africans to Christianity. So, in a sense, they're like a cultural Creole group. They're not seeing Africa so much as going home as they're seeing it a chance to set up new opportunities, but also to Christianize. They did find the church a real place of solace in Nova Scotia and in Africa and wherever they ended up, essentially.
I imagine that those African Americans who arrived in Canada as the slaves of white loyalists must have lived and worked under similar conditions to the slaves who lived and worked in rural New England, where slaves helped clear land, farm, and lived in the family's house. Is this an accurate picture of how slaves in Canada lived and worked?
Yes, it is. Slavery in Loyalist Nova Scotia was very similar to slavery in the northern United States. I mean, there's no basis here for plantation slavery. So as a result, there's less population concentration. Essentially, they could be jacks of all trades. We could see slaves as domestics. We could see them as farm workers. We could see them working on board ships. So they were ubiquitous. They were everywhere, but in much smaller concentration. Probably the most prominent type of slave in this context was domestic. But as I said, you could find them in practically every part of the economy in Nova Scotia.
Bonnie, one of your positions at the University of New Brunswick is coordinator of Loyalist Studies. and you have this neat project there called the Loyalist Research Network. Would you tell us about that project?
In 2008, we formed what we called the Loyalist Research Network. And that's a network of researchers, both academic and non-academic. And they're all interested in loyalists, loyalism, or the Loyalist era. Now, we began this network as a group of folks interested in the Loyalists in maritime Canada. But the more that I reach out, the more that I realize that the interest in the Loyalists is really burgeoning lately. So I'm going to work this summer to transform the network into an international network where researchers can talk to each other from various contexts. What I'm finding rather interesting is that some of the most exciting work on Loyalists today is being done in the United States. A number of scholars are interested in now not the Loyalists who enter the diaspora, but the Loyalists who either go back to the States or reintegrated back into the States and had been there all along. So I really would like to begin more of a conversation with folks working on the Loyalists in the United States as well as, various places across the globe. So I'm really hoping that this network helps us to connect with each other and helps us to talk to each other. Now, this is a rather basic website at this time, a list of researchers, a list of resources. But as I say, I'm really hoping to transform it into a way in which we can engage in dialogue. So the website is going to change over the next few months into something more substantial. I also have a listserv. And in preparation for today, I talked to people on my listserv and I asked them questions about, for example, the evacuation, various questions, and they all responded. We had a really interesting time just talking to each other about Loyalist issues. So that's the kind of thing I'd like to do, but on a much grander scale. So if there's any of your listeners out there, Liz, who would be interested in joining up, I'd be more than happy to provide them with any information they need. Just go to that website and see if you want to sign up as a researcher or even just an interested person.
And what's the web address for the Loyalist Research Network?
www.loyalistresearchnet.org.
To go back to something you said earlier, it really does seem like Loyalists are having a moment. Do we know why that is?
That's a really interesting question. I guess it depends on who you ask, but I'm wondering if part of it might be the refugee crises we're seeing these days. We're all familiar with the Syrian refugee crisis, see it on the news all the time. And what some argue right now is that the Loyalists were also wartime refugees, that they experienced a refugee crisis of their own when they arrived in exile. They lived in refugee camps, they had provisioning crises, just like we're seeing throughout the world in terms of those who are accepting Syrian refugees. The Nova Scotia government had a really hard time accommodating the Loyalist influx with all the refugees. We're seeing similar scenarios in Europe when it comes to the accommodation of refugees. So I'm wondering if part of it might be the refugee crisis we're seeing all around us. I think another issue might be what happens in a time of war, where we all look around us and we see many wars that are happening throughout the globe. I think we're rather tuned in now in terms of what it means to come down on either side. Both countries, Canada and the United States, have had controversies over participation in certain wars, and we know what can happen if you're accused of supporting or not supporting a particular war. So I think at the end of the day, all history is in some way semi-autobiographical. So I think what's going on around us definitely influences what our historical interests are. So I think those might be a couple of reasons why the Loyalists are becoming, a lot more popular these days.
Let's move into the time warp. This is a fun segment of the show where we ask you a hypothetical history question about what might have happened if something had occurred differently or if someone had acted differently.
The time warp. Historians can't predict the future, but they can speculate about what might have been.
In your opinion, what might have happened if Great Britain had won the American War for Independence? How would the lack of a Loyalist diaspora have affected the development of Canada and the Atlantic world?
I actually asked people in my Loyalist research network what they would say to such a question. There was a difference of opinion amongst the members of my network. A couple of my colleagues actually said that if Britain had won, what we would see would be the formation of a colonial federation, or if you will, a dominion of North America. So rather than have Canada and the United States, we'd have a dominion of North America, a colonial federation, with probably some representation in the British Parliament. They also thought that Loyalists would have been the winners this time, so there would be a changing balance of power and of government. There would be a different set of political and religious leaders who would have risen up, but probably there would be a gradual assumption of self-government, just like you see in Canadian and Australian history. So that was one of the responses to my question, that there would be the formation of some sort of colonial federation or maybe a dominion of North America. Another colleague of mine said, however, that if Britain won the war, he didn't think it would have staved off American independence for very long. He thought that the grievances that the Americans had probably would not have been resolved at that point, and that their feelings were strong enough that they wouldn't have been buried for very long. So if the Americans weren't successful this time, they probably would have been successful a few years from then. So that's kind of two different directions that members of my Loyalist Research Network entered. Very different responses.
Bonnie, you know so much about Loyalists. Would you help out your American friends by recommending a few books about Loyalists and their experiences in Canada?
One of my favorite books right now is Money Whitfield's book, North to Bondage, Loyalist Slavery in the Maritimes. It's a great book. It's just come out in 2016, and it does talk about the arrival of Black Loyalists, but particularly how Loyalists brought with them slaves, and we really have the expansion of slavery during the Loyalist era in Nova Scotia. So it's an entirely different take, really, on the Loyalists by focusing on slavery per se. I'd also like to suggest a little book called Loyalist Rebellion in New Brunswick by David Bell. It's a book which shows us how American Loyalists, when they landed on the streets of St. John, New Brunswick, essentially recreated some of the tensions of the American Revolution all over again. You have Loyalists fighting against Loyalists over issues like liberty and authority. And essentially some worried that another American Revolution was starting in the Loyalist diaspora. I'd also like to suggest Liam Riordan and Jerry Bannister's book called The Loyal Atlantic. It's a collection of essays from a conference on Loyalists and Loyalism at the University of Maine in Orono a few years ago. And it's really interesting because it places the Loyalists not within American or Canadian history, but in a broader British Atlantic world history. And lastly, I'd like to suggest a group blog. It's called Borealia. And it's a blog on early Canadian history. And you'll find some posts there on the Loyalists, quite a few actually. It's been one of the more popular series on Borealia, but also other aspects of early Canadian history if you're interested in the colonial period in a Canadian context.
And what aspect of Loyalist history are you researching and writing about now?
I've got 3 projects on the go. The one I started with was a project on how uprooted Loyalists recreated community upon arrival and exile in the Maritimes. So I was interested in how uprooted peoples try to recreate a sense of community again. What I found interesting is that they used sociability as a way to do that. So like the people I study in Shelburne, one of the first things they do upon arrival at a new place is to engage in dinner parties, have balls and banquets, establish Freemasonic lodges, establish taverns. So I'm very interested in how 18th century sociability has been used by the Loyalists to help recreate community in their new home. Another interest that I have is Loyalist Freemasonry. We usually associate Freemasons, I think, with the Patriots, with founding fathers like George Washington, who was a Freemason. But I found lodges founded by Loyalists as well, and many of these Loyalists brought Freemasonic lodges with them into exile. I've come across lodges in Shelburne and St. John, which began in places like Boston and New York City, but also were transferred to places like St. John and Shelburne, and many of the members were still intact. So I'm very interested in the Loyalist Freemasons as a networking association, a way in which Loyalists were able to hang together and, again, recreate a sense of community once they arrive in a new community. And lastly, I'm following around the British Atlantic world a military engineer named William Booth. He was a late 18th century engineer who was posted in various places. He began his career in Gibraltar for the Great Siege, and he was sent to Shelburne, which is where I first encountered him, where he tried to accommodate the Loyalists and provided a really interesting diary on Loyalist society in Shelburne.
Wow, Bonnie, you have a lot of projects. Good luck with them. Is there a place where we can go to learn more about your work and how we can get in contact with you if we still have questions about Loyalists in Canada?
My contact information can be found on a couple of websites. One is the loyalistresearchnet.org website. Also, if you go to the University of New Brunswick History Department, you can scroll through the list of faculty and you can find me that way as well. But I'm also on Ben Franklin's World Facebook page. I'm more than happy to receive messages via the Facebook page. And also, I'd like to give out my email address. It's huskins@stu.ca.
Bonnie Huskins, thank you for being an active member of the Ben Franklin's World listener community on Facebook and for revealing the experiences of the Loyalists who went to Canada.
Oh, I'm very happy to do so, and I am really pumped about being a member of Ben Franklin's World.
The American Loyalists were not the losers of the American Revolution, but their loyalty to Great Britain certainly came at a cost. Many Loyalists lost property, money, and relationships over their political beliefs. Thousands of Loyalists became war refugees who were forced to leave their homes in the new United States. And these men and women and their families had to relocate all over the Atlantic world and around the British Empire, including to British Canada. The Loyalists' relocation to Canada had profound effects on this colony and its development. Loyalists helped to expand Canada and to establish new cultural, civic, and educational institutions within its borders. However, the towns and communities in which they lived often didn't exist upon their arrival. Like other American pioneers, Loyalists worked hard to clear the land and to build new homes in a new place. But in the process of rebuilding their lives, the Loyalists sometimes displaced Native Americans, Acadians, and other Canadians. Our exploration today reminds us that there are always multiple ways to view historic events and people. For example, the American Revolution and its war for independence allowed some North Americans to claim liberty and freedom, while others remained enslaved, and still others felt oppressed by patriot-led committees and governments. Each of these groups witnessed the revolution, but they experienced the event differently. It's only by investigating and considering all of their viewpoints that we will gain a better understanding of the revolution and its impact. You can find more information about Bonnie, the Loyalist Research Network, plus everything we talked about today on the show notes page, benfranklinsworld.com/085. Episode 100 is quickly approaching, and I need your questions. What would you like to know about the show, my work as a historian, or what I do in my off time? Send your questions to liz@benfranklinsworld.com, tweet me @LizCovart, or post a comment on the show notes page for this episode, or in our listener community on Facebook.
And remember, never leave till tomorrow that which you can do today.